Hello and welcome to the Evolving Christian Faith Network videocast. My name is Bo McGuffey. I also go by the name Irreverence on the web, and the overarching goal of the Evolving Christian Faith Network is to resource progressive Christians so that they can explore new theological and spiritual horizons. And sometimes I do that through like a brief reflection, and other times through sort of a more academic look at a topic maybe. But today I want to do that with a sermon. When I preach, I generally use what is called the lectionary. Now, the lectionary is a series of set readings that span throughout the year. Basically, it's year A, year B, year C, and it's the same readings on a 3-year cycle. And the idea is that as you go through the story, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Testament, you're effectively covering certain themes. And one of the wonderful things about the lectionary is that the person who's preaching doesn't get to have control over the passage necessarily. I mean, you've got some selections to choose from, but you don't have complete control. So you can't pick and choose what you want to talk about. And that makes it a little more difficult to do a sermon, because that means that I have to wrestle a little bit more with the passage and ask, what does this mean to me today? As I prepared for this, I looked at the passage for June 29th, 2014, and I gotta say it's quite the doozy. Back to the June 29th part. It's after June 29th. You might ask, why are you preaching from June 29th? Well, it's because I was planning on recording it to post it on that day. However, other circumstances prevented me from doing so until now. I did the sermon and then I went to record it, didn't have time for it, and that brings us to recording it today. But anyway, today it turns out that this particular passage that was set for June 29th, 2014, is actually one of the more controversial passages, I would say, in the entire Hebrew Bible. This is the story of what happens after God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son on the altar. And this is what the passage says. Now, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard, and this is Genesis chapter 22, verse 1b to 14. And b, what that means is it's taking the last half of the verse. So it's Genesis 22, 1b to 14. And it says, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. And God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. And so Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. And then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. And so the 2 of them walked together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Excuse me. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand, took his knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And then Abraham said, Here I am. And the angel said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place, The Lord Will Provide. And there's actually a Hebrew term for it, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, what in the world are we to make of this? Well, what one hears in the story largely depends upon that baggage that one brings to the table when they sit down to read it. So, if by chance you are one of those people who could be considered the true believers, then Abraham is someone who's held up as the epitome of faith. He hears God tell him to sacrifice his son to him. This is frightening and disturbing to Abraham. He loves his son very, very much. This is his only beloved son. But as an act of devotion to his true love, who is God, he goes ahead and goes through with the sacrifice. However, God changes his mind at the last second and says, wait, I don't want that. Abraham, of course, is relieved, and he learns that when he is faithful to God, God is faithful to him. And so, Abraham is the epitome of faith, a model for any true believer. Now, that's one way to look at it. Others, those who are more critical, especially atheists, hear something completely different. Now, let's think about this. Think first about who God is according to this story, and then second, we're going to look at who Abraham is. You see, God demands that Abraham, who seems to be his favorite person in the whole wide world, he demands that Abraham kill his beloved son for, quite frankly, what is no good reason whatsoever. This demand is all about ego. This is God saying, hey, look, I'm God, and I can do whatever I want to do. So I'm going to tell you, I want you to cut out your son's heart. Why? Because I can. Really? What does this say about the character of this God? Quite frankly, when we look at it from this perspective, this God is downright insane. And if we think about it a little bit more, it actually gets worse. Because when Abraham actually gets ready to go through with the act, right before the killing blow, God says, psych! Just kidding! Now, imagine the level of emotional abuse that this God is just slathering on his most devout follower. In this story, God is nothing less than the idealized image of a psychopath. And if that doesn't make this story bad enough, let's look at Abraham. You see, Abraham hears a voice, and that voice says to him, I want you to kill your son for me. And his response is, sure. I mean, really? This is also quite insane. What parent in her or his right mind would dare even consider such a thing? Just because someone hears a voice that they think might be God, it doesn't necessarily mean that they should assume that it is the voice of God and that they should obey mindlessly. This is religious zeal, taken to its darkest corner. Abraham is the idealized vision of an abusive, destructive, and metaphorically speaking, demonic religion. He is very simply a sick, sick man, and the world needs to be protected from him in some way. It is no wonder that militant atheists point to this story to show that religion in this world is not just problematic, something you can kind of argue with and sort of have a debate with. It's not just problematic, or it's not just a speed bump to progress, but rather it is downright dangerous in a death-bringing way. So Abraham, is he a hero, or is he a dangerously sick man? God. Is God a gracious, or is God a psychopath? It depends on the baggage that you're bringing to the table when you read this story. Now, I can certainly appreciate and understand both of these understandings of this passage. And I think Dare I say so? I think that they are both valid in some sense. But I also think that both of these readings miss something very important, and that is the context in which the story was created. You see, when I approach biblical texts, my initial question is, how does this story reflect the attitudes and beliefs of the people for whom and by whom it was written? I look first and foremost at biblical texts as historical documents, because that's what they are, first and foremost, historical documents created by human beings in time and space. Texts created in a context. And so my understanding of this particular Bible passage is that it came into being during a time in which child sacrifice was really just simply part of religion in the Middle East. Israel's neighbors were doing it. Israel was doing it. Everybody was doing it. Why would they do such a thing? Well, back then people believed that it was the responsibility of humans to offer sacrifices to the gods. Many believed that this was the very reason that humans were created in the first place, to maintain that sacrificial system and thus bringing honor to the gods. And that's just the way it was back then. This is the cultural context of this passage. And so when we look at the story of Abraham in this context, we can imagine that those listening to this story are sitting there listening to it, and they're hearing the story and everything, and they're going, yeah, sacrifice your son to me, etc., because the demand for child sacrifice was just something that happened. Yes, it sucks, but somebody's got to do it, right? And since Abraham is the cultural patriarch, of the story, then it makes sense that it would be him who would have to make the sacrifice in this story. It's just sort of an expectation of the position. But then we get to the end of the story. And Abraham is about to fulfill that divine commission. He's got the knife in his hand and he's ready to go. And then suddenly God stops him and says, no, that's not what I want. And this ending, see, this is the trick. This ending in that cultural context, I believe, is shocking. Because remember, the expectation is that God is going to demand the child sacrifice. It is not expected that God is going to say that God doesn't want the sacrifice of that human child. So it seems to me that what this story does in context is that it sets the God of Israel apart from the gods that surround Israel. The gods that surround Israel demand human sacrifice because that's the place of human beings. They were created to maintain that sacrificial system. That's why they're there. This God, however, is actively rejecting that as an appropriate way to worship this God. So basically saying, if you feel the need to sacrifice, don't use a human being, use a ram. Now, do we know for sure that this is indeed what this text means in context? No. This is something we can never really know. We can never really know those kinds of things. All we can do is to try to decipher such things based on the historical evidence that we have. And it seems to me that the best I can come up with is that the Israelites at one point participated in sacrificing children to their God, because that's what they believed that their God wanted. And then, upon reflection, they changed their mind. And they came to believe that God no longer wanted this. So how they understood their God, how they understood their God had changed, okay? And perhaps it was that they understood that God itself had changed. So either they said, we understood God differently and our understanding has changed, or they understood that God and God's self had changed. But regardless, they accepted that changing like this was an important part of their evolution as a people. Now, in my own faith journey, I can relate to the distress and the joy that comes from understanding the divine in a different way. having gone through many transitions myself. On the one hand, when I reflect back to what empowered me in my faith and how I treated others as a result of it, there is, for me, a sense of loss and a sense of shame. And yet, those transitions open me up to new possibilities as I shed the old in favor of the new. Yes, the old that we're used to is safe and secure, and if we stick with it, we never really have to admit that we ever made any mistakes, and we can avoid eating crow. But I've found that the new, embracing the new, brings forth a kind of adventure that renews vitality in my own spiritual life. So in this story, I understand there are different ways of understanding. Other people are going to understand it differently, but this story, what I hear above all things is a validation of certain aspects of that process of growing and becoming as we live and grow in our faith. And this validation recognizes my past for what it is. I've done things. I'm not proud of all of the things that I've done. I've done them, and in retrospect, I kind of wish I hadn't. But I also know that I did them at the time because I truly believed that what I was doing was the right thing to do at the time. And with that recognition of the mistakes of my past as mistakes comes a certain amount of regret and shame that I now have to bear. I cannot turn back time. I cannot fix those mistakes I made in the past. And more so, as I reflect on my existence as a human being, what I also know is that as I continue to do what I truly believe is right, I will continue to make mistakes. And I will continually add to my regrets and to my sense of shame. But what I also know is that in recognizing that I have made mistakes and in committing to changing so as not to make those same mistakes again, I show that my past does not determine my fate. And I can allow my past to inform my becoming. I can learn from my mistakes if you will, while not at the same time allowing those very same mistakes to enslave me. And so by recognizing, accepting, and committing to changing in order to avoid repeating the mistakes of my past, I am embracing what I believe is a divine power that enables me to carve out a new personal destiny. In short, my past does not determine my future. It's what I do with it that does. And that's what I hear above all things in this passage. And so, I want to say thank you very much, everyone who is listening to this video. Thank you very much for spending time to me. Again, my name is Bo McGuffey with the Evolving Christian Faith Network. I hope that you have found at least a little bit of inspiration during our time together. And if so, I would like to hear what that is, so please feel free to reply to this entry on my blog, evolvingchristianfaith.net. Anyway, I hope to see you again, and until next time, peace.